all can tell you not to sing your story? Who all can tell you that you're singing off key? You are the dancer, you are not the dancer. You are the song, not the one who sang. Be a beautiful songbird. No, you tell the truth. You tell the truth. You tell the truth.
Welcome, everyone. This is Thrive with Morella, the show for people who want to thrive, body, mind, heart, and spirit. And today we're talking about spaces. And I have something for you to think about before I introduce you to my next guest. In your life, or in life in general, and in this modern life that we're sometimes living, sometimes there are more chores to do than there's time to do them. Or when your budget is always tight because of the many expenses in your household. Or when you find that you're always tired, always looking for something, and never fully able to relax in your house. Or arguing with your spouse because of all the stress of everything that needs fixing and doing in your house. What if the answer to all of this is to move into a much smaller house? So my guest today is Patricia Foreman. She's the author of the book that I have right here, A Tiny Home to Call Your Own. And the subtitle is Living Well in Just Right Houses. And I love that. Patricia is not only an author, she's also a Class A contractor. And she's the co-founder of the first tiny house construction company in the U.S. And she currently lives in a very small home in Indiana, right?
That's correct, yes.
So, Pat, I am so thrilled to have you on the show. Welcome to Thrive with Morella.
Well, Morella, it's an honor to be on your show. I so appreciate you having me. And it's a topic that's so timely. I think not only for the past generation, but also for the present and future generations. There's a lot in our planet and on our happiness that depends on appropriate housing.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. So, you're starting with the question that I kind of drafted for last. So I'll just ask you right off the bat, and I'll ask you that first. So obviously you are passionate about this. Your book is wonderful. It's a really lovely, easy read, but it's also an extraordinary resource book. When I read your book, I feel like, oh wow, she's on a mission with this book. So why are you so passionate about this idea of not so big houses, tiny houses perhaps?
I'm passionate about that, along with sustainable local agriculture, along with optimal health, because if we're going to have optimal lives, we need all those factors to work together. They're synergistic, and that's why I think tiny houses, I've lived in big houses, I've lived in really small houses, I live in 750 square feet now, and it's just right. And what it's done is free me to pursue a lot of my other interests at this point in my life especially. And one of the things it's also done is forced me to deal with my stuff.
Right.
You can't live in a small space until you deal with your stuff. And I'm still continuing to deal with my stuff. I'm not completely over it. It's kind of ongoing, but it's also really made me ponder, meditate on it, and be grateful for what I don't have in my life anymore, as well as what if I do have in my life. So I think a lot of our stuff identifies us. We define ourselves as certain paintings or arts or how we decorate our house. But I want my life, and I've lived my life, to be a unique, handcrafted life. And I want my housing to reflect that.
I love that. Unique, handcrafted. Yeah, I love that you emphasize the idea of quality where, small doesn't need to be cheap, but rather the opposite, that it could be, it could be exquisite. And therefore, by doing exquisite in a smaller scale, it can be actually quite affordable. Now, I was curious. So you just said you live in a 750 square foot house. And is it just you and a partner? I know you've got at least one dog.
That's right. It's what it is I bought a mid-century marvel house. It's partly underground. and I've done this quite a bit throughout my career, but I rent the upper part of it. I just didn't need that amount. So it's part of, passive income or other multiple streams of income. I'm really big on multiple streams of income, which saved me through that great recession we had in 2008, I can tell you. But it's just right now, I know it was a lazy asset and I didn't need it. It's a beautiful space. So I decided to just go ahead and finish it off and rent it out. So I'm living in the space below that. And it's about 3 feet underground with windows that just
yes.
I love it. It's just love it.
Oh,
so your question was, I don't think I answered your question.
Well, I was curious whether it was just your own space, but really the question I wanted. Yes.
Yeah.
Who do you live with? Yeah. Do you live with your dog? Well, and the reason is that sometimes people, we all sometimes have this idea that places are too small to live, more than just one person or to have a pet or that sort of thing. And I know that you, at very least, have a four-legged companion.
Oh yes, I do. I adopted a full-blooded, genetically superior hybrid mutt for Christmas. That was my Christmas present. She came from the dog pound, and one of the best things I've done. She's up to 40 pounds now. So she's here, and I have 2 cats. One's a Maine Coon cat, and don't tell anybody, but just about 23 chickens in the backyard.
Oh, I love it.
And I live in town, but they're so quiet, and my neighbors love me. It's just
I love it. Well, yeah.
Well, just one thing. It was interesting. I am single right now at this point in life, which is working for now.
Your connection.
I haven't always been. Maybe I won't be in the future. I don't know. But can you hear okay?
Yeah, you're just coming back. All of a sudden, you froze a little bit. But so maybe in the future. But you were going to say your main.
Well, my mother made a really interesting comment. I was asking her. When she was 98 3/4. She died at 99 3/4. But when she was 98, we were talking about my dad, and I said, if he came in the door, what would you do now? She was in a really lovely 1-bedroom apartment at this really nice retirement, and she took a deep breath and she looked one way and she kind of looked around the other way and she goes. She teared up and she said, "Oh, I'd be so happy to see him, but he'd have to get his own apartment." and reflecting on what Katharine Hepburn said to Spencer Tracy, live close by and visit often.
Yes, and they did that for many years.
They did, yes.
But one of the things that I got from your book right off the bat, which I really appreciated, was the idea that your book is titled A Tiny Home, and you live in a 750 square foot home, but it doesn't necessarily mean that a small tiny home needs to be, what we're seeing a lot of in TV, that it's like this, almost like the size home that you can mount on a trailer kind of a thing. I really appreciated that you start off by saying it can be a just right, not so big house. So what would you define as a small home, just so we can help our viewers and our listeners get an idea of what you're talking about when you talk about small homes.
Sure. And by the way, I'm not against large houses. If that's their dream and their passion and they're not a slave to their house every weekend, like I've heard some people talk with me about, I think that's fine. But we generally, and the larger houses, start generally, again, you can't snap a chalk line, as to the square footage, but around 4,000 square feet and above are kind of considered the mini mansions.
Right.
That's when you got multiple bedrooms of 4, 5, 6. A typical house, your 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 2-car garage house is about 1,200 to 2,000 square feet. And I call small/tiny homes about 500 to 800. And then we built tiny homes that were literally about I think our smallest was about 225 square feet to about 500 square feet.
Oh, wow.
Some were on foundations, some were on trailers, but that was the tiny home. So with my house right now, with my home, I guess I'd say with my small home, tiny home, small home, it includes my libraries. I mean, I'm a book hoarder, I have to say, so I have bookshelves above the doorways,
Yeah.
And it includes a lot of shelving, a lot of space that is multifunctional, meaning I have a small fulfillment center, and my dining room doubles as a little exercise room, and the table is a fulfillment center, a work center, a dining room table. And so Sarah Susanka, in her book, Not So not so big house to find pods of space.
Right.
And that's what really comes in handy. When a lot of people, when they think of really tiny houses, they think it's all closed in and boxed in like you're in a closet.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be that way at all. And we used structural we used home designs that gave you the feeling of spaciousness, even though it's a smaller area, like having cathedral ceilings,
right,
or open beam ceilings. So, yeah, there's a lot to putting into a tiny house and be able to live large.
Yeah, and the high ceilings are extraordinary to give that sense of space, even if, the square footage, horizontally or on the ground isn't huge. And the other thing you mentioned in the book several times is designing in a way where you do away with all hallways or any, kind of transition space that isn't actually leveraged or has a use for anything, which is actually good design. When you look at house plans, at layouts for some of these big houses, they have tons of hallways that just speak to me of horrible design, kind of lazy design.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that stood out for me about the core message of your book that I think this to me could be like the punchline, because I think hits home for so many people. And you've already mentioned the idea of stuff, where you say, when you end up, and I think we've all had this experience, that you move into a space that's larger than the space where you were living before, and then you get the stuff to fill it.
Right.
So then you say, which, oh my God, this is such a truism. You say, and then you're paying for space, heated, air-conditioned space to hold the stuff that you got to fill the space that you moved into. And, so many of us have stuff that we haven't used in years. So clearly, that is a core driving point of your book that I loved. But, you touch on so many different advantages and kind of a reframe in terms of how we can think of spaces. So can you tell us or talk to us about some of the biggest advantages that you have found for yourself and for people who've moved into smaller homes, whether they're tiny or maybe, 1,200, 1,500. Just right. Yeah.
And of course, one of the things we're finding too, I'll address what you just asked, but a lot of people are using tiny homes for their hobbies or their office, so they don't have to commute so far. I mean, there are a lot of different, I think there's 16 or 17 different uses for tiny houses in the books that aren't just necessarily as your living quarters.
Right.
But the advantages are significant. For me personally, the financial advantages, of course, you have a smaller mortgage, smaller footprint, smaller property to maintain. Not always, though. I mean, I've got a half acre, which is where my chickens are. Lower utility bills is a really big one. I mean, with my house being partly underground, it stays warm in the winter and cool in the summer. Mm-hmm. And my electric bill runs around $25 a month.
Oh, my God.
Great. Yeah. So it has a smaller footprint, and it takes much less energy to maintain it. If something does need repair, it's smaller.
Right.
It's less expensive to even repair it.
Mm-hmm.
The living advantages, it's interesting because there are quite a few of those too. Just fewer worries. It's easier to clean. Mm-hmm. I mean, literally, I can plug my vacuum sweeper in and pretty much clean 2/3 of the house without unplugging the vacuum, which is nice. And of course, it's just less physical energy to maintain. And hardwood floors or hard floors is a must in a smaller house, because foot pads, you go, like in the kitchen when it gets muddy, I just put down a cardboard paper box and lay it out, and we just walk on that because it's just so when the mud season's here.
Yeah.
So that's one advantage that one lady we built a tiny house for was she was tired of her family coming and living with her and mooching off of her. She had to cook for them. She felt she had to entertain them. They were in her space. So we literally built a one bedroom. I think it was a 500 or maybe it was 750 square foot house. So when they came, if they had to sleep on the couch if they were going to be there,
Yeah, of course.
It was specifically because she did not want to have so many visitors.
Yeah. So I have the opposite question because I socialize. I'm a 50-50 extrovert introvert, and so I socialize oftentimes like an extrovert. And so for the extroverts who are watching and listening and saying, Pat, but what do I do about the parties that I love to have? You know, my problem in my space is that, you know, I sometimes host birthday parties for myself and realize, oh my God, I invited way more people than is probably wise to have. And you know, fortunately, some people can, you know, don't make it. So when somebody has all of the reasons to move into a smaller home and they're really excited about it, about all, you know, the financial pieces, the sustainability, the ease of maintenance, you know, the coziness, all of that you've just mentioned, but they say, but I really want to entertain.
Yeah.
What do you suggest for them?
Well, what I suggest for them is what I do. I like to entertain too, and there are two quick answers to that. One is just about everything I have is on wheels. So my bookcases, my filing cabinets, certainly the tables that I have, a little drop leaf table for my little writing table, and then a dining room table that expands to seat 12. Was it 8? It expands with 2 leaves, whatever. It was my grandfather's oak table, which I dearly love. So everything can kind of be shuffled around to create different functions for different spaces within it. It's sort of like, what would be an analogy be?
Yeah.
Well, it's like, you know, you move the tables back and the chairs back and you have a dance.
Right.
Right. And the other thing is we really like, when we were building the tiny houses, is to do a big deck. Mm-hmm. It helps to bring the outdoors in. Sometimes the deck could be larger than the footprint of the house. Right. And so literally you step right out, there are benches there, and you can have quite a few people that go inside as well as outside the house. So right. I have a very large patio here for the size of the house, which I do entertain on. Wonderful to sit on the back.
Yeah, so I loved the idea also, as you're mentioning the decks, when you mentioned, one of the things you mentioned early in the book is the idea that living in a smaller house helps you bring the outside in with greater ease, where you feel there's less of a barrier between you and being outside, you know, your patio, your deck, or whatever it may be. So you also talk about health reasons and, you know, some of the benefits of having a smaller house or a just right house. Can you talk about some of those, some of the factors that you... I love that you're chuckling. Tell us, talk to us about that.
Well, I have to revert back to my dear deceased mother, who was, to put it mildly, a hoarder. Anything that would be useful to anybody anywhere was not wasted. And she came up through the Depression era, as my dad did, and they had just, you know, it was quite a tough story. But just simply not having so many things in the cabinet when you open it up and it falls out. Not so much that you have to shuffle around furniture to where you can't clean properly. Right. Just to be able to get that done. Health reasons, I always like the, when we built, we always use the low hypoallergenic paints and finishes on the floor, because there are so many people now with allergies. Yeah. I always, when I give other talks, I'll say, who besides me has absolutely no allergy at all? And you know, not that many hands go up, but growing up, none of us had allergy. Right. So that's part of it. And keeping your stuff in order so you don't trip over it. And, right. Do that sort of thing. Well,
and you know, the stress factor, I think, has to be huge. You know, I tend to be a somewhat tidy person, but when my house isn't feeling tidy or clean, the whole house feels like it's a chore. So you're busy, you have a busy lifestyle, you've got work, you've got all these things to do, and then every room you're walking into feels like it's another chore. That can be really stressful and draining.
Very stressful. And it's bad energy too. I mean, right. Because it's interesting, there was studies have done, they've replicated it, where the average person spends about 30 minutes a day looking for stuff that they can't find. And I said, oh, that can't be true. So I timed myself. Okay, where's my glasses? What happened to my 2 keys? You know, where are those papers? Where's that file I was working on? And what's interesting is if you extrapolate that out, that comes to about 7.5 weeks a year, right, just looking for things. So besides the stress and the frustration. So,
right.
So
and if
really, pays to be tidy.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you're not walking through a 4,000 square foot home to look for the thing that you're missing, you're probably saving some time walking back and forth. But, another health factor that I had never thought about in terms of a small home, particularly one that you build, is the air filtration that you guys built into homes that I think, oh my God, that must be extraordinary. So can you tell us a little bit about that technology and how it works in a small home and what the challenge might be in doing it in a larger one?
Well, air quality is a big issue, and it affects our whole health. When you talk about an air filtration system, what I have now is one of the through the walls units that does air conditioning and heating, and I keep a negative ion generator going quite a lot.
Wow, inside your house.
Inside the house, absolutely. And there are also these crystal lights that you have with the Himalayan crystal salts, and all that gives off negative electrons. And we are energetic beings,
right.
and one of the things that we run on is electrons.
Right.
And I think all that really helps. But it also keeps the smog and some of the allergens and pollution that comes in. So I'm big on filtering. Filtering the air inside the house, especially in the winter. In the summer, not so much. But I live in a rural area. It's a small town, and there's not that much industrial pollution here.
Right.
But if there were, I would certainly be filtering the air.
Yeah.
Along with the water. Reverse osmosis water systems are
right.
really, I think, part of a health plan, because there was a study what they found is I'm a pharmacist, and the amount of drugs that are literally peed and pooped into the water supply system, they're not even tested for by the public water systems, and they're not filtered out.
Right.
And a good friend of mine had her sort of cellular analysis done, and they found all kinds of drugs that she'd never had.
That is actually a frightening fact about tap water that a lot of people don't even realize. In fact, I think that there are some tests about umbilical cord blood where they find traces of prescription medications that the mother never, ever took.
Ever had.
Yeah, exactly. And that's and so a whole house water filtration system would be something that's a much more I don't know if affordable, but
I think the reverse osmosis is very, very affordable. It's just under the sink, a little storage tank and some filters. But then also rainwater harvesting is really good, and that's what I'm setting up on my coop, is to be able to get rainwater harvesting for my garden and coop this year. So.
Which I have to say, other than hearing about rainwater harvesting in Bermuda, because there is no other source of fresh water, I had never thought of rainwater harvesting as something that one could, should even consider. I'm like, oh, that's so smart. Because even if you have tap water or you have a well, it just makes sense, no?
Well, I think it does. It's so simple. The water falls. It's already been somewhat purified, distilled, although it does have some gases and maybe other things in it. But it's there. It's free, and all you need to do is just have it run off into a barrel, and be able to tap it.
Right, and if you're going to use it for consumption, then you run it through your filter.
Yeah, you can run it through another filter if you want to.
So I'm curious to ask you kind of a cultural, philosophical question, because, as I was reading your book, and I actually just got back from a 12-day trip to Ireland, which was wonderful, but
nice.
One of the things that I notice in Europe, if you look at, I've never been to Japan, but from what I've seen and read about Japan, both in Europe and Japan and, some places in Latin America, spaces tend to be smaller. And there doesn't seem to be as much of a stuff culture as we seem to have in the U.S. And so, as I was thinking about our conversation today, I thought, I wonder what Pat would say as to why do you think the U.S. has become such a stuff-obsessed and size-obsessed culture?
Well, I think it was right after World War II, I think, is when the whole thing shifted. When the troops came back and the great American dream was a house, to have your own house and yard. That was almost unheard of for so many people. And then we got into this affluenza. There's a documentary called Affluenza that I highly recommend. It was written back in the 60s or 70s. But it the stuff started, the appliances came in, so women could be freer to do other things, especially all the gadgets, hobbies expanded, things became relatively affordable, and it just became, our lives were about stuff.
Right.
Gaining stuff was the status symbol. The larger the house, the more status you apparently had.
Yeah.
And I think especially, I respect the millenniums so much, because they're coming along. They're not so interested in stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, they're tapped in, tuned in, turned on in so many ways, and they would rather rent until they get settled and delay marriage for quite a while. So I think partly what's interesting with respect to stuff is we're in a transition phase where we're beginning to realize that stuff can't make us happy. It never really could, not for very long anyway.
Yeah.
It's great driving that new car around. And I also think that the demographics are driving the whole tiny house movement, because as older people downsize, all of a sudden they don't need to keep their kids' school supplies anymore from when they were 40 years ago when they were, and this has happened, and they just realize that they don't need all the things that they needed when they were having a family or having fun. So we've got the older part of the population downsizing, and then we've got the younger population. They're delaying marriage. About, back in 1960, here's an interesting statistic. About 1960, about 50 years ago, a little longer, about 7% of all adults were married. So fast forward to today, and it's only about 45% are single. So the demographics are changing with respect to the view of marriage and what it means on that. There's over 35 million single head of household people in the U.S. So they're not wanting that necessarily 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom half.
Yeah.
And the trends are going to keep going that way. I think towards being more unique individuals, lifestyles, alternative lifestyles. So the question is, why is the zoning not acknowledging, and why are people not demanding more appropriate sized housing?
Right.
And the builders not building.
Yeah, well, and one article that I read recently that is kind of the flip side to what we're talking about today in terms of going smaller is that a lot of the people who went really big, there are hundreds, if not thousands of houses sitting on the market, this 5,000, 6,000 square foot, 7,000 square foot houses, the multi-million-dollar homes that some baby boomers and even, the early Gen Xers built, and now they're wanting to sell them and they can't sell them. And so
they can't sell them. Yeah.
Nobody wants those huge houses. Or, I mean, not nobody, but, the majority of people are not really.
They can't afford them, even if they could.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, you nailed it. Right you bullseye.
Yeah. So, what's interesting, and you mentioned this in a number of ways, having a smaller home is a great financial investment, because, you're not sinking as much money into the house itself. And, the resale, you mentioned it also several times where the home retains its resale value much better than a larger home. And,
it appreciates faster because it has a broader base of people that can afford it.
Right.
With the smaller homes. Yeah.
Exactly. It appreciates faster. So for you, well, before I ask you that question, I just want to acknowledge that we're going to say goodbye to our TV viewers in just a minute, and I want to remind them of your wonderful book. So Pat's book is A Tiny Home to Call Your Own, Living Well in Just Right Houses, and that's available. You can find that online wherever you buy your books. And it's a great resource for anyone considering moving, considering building a house. Highly encourage you reading it, because what I loved about it, Pat, is that it's also kind of a resource book. You have so many references to other resources to look at. You have ideas for furniture, you have ideas for room design, just so much good information that I think it's a great resource for anybody considering building, considering moving. Great stuff. So we're going to say goodbye to our TV friends because our time on TV ends in the next few house?
Well, for me personally, there's something magical about living in the smaller space that I live in. It's interesting because I'll set my perception is at a different level than it is in a larger space. And if things happen outside, the wind is blowing, or I'll notice the trees are dancing, or I'm more tuned into my environment than I am in a larger building. And it's interesting because our culture really doesn't have the vocabulary to define living in a small house, but cozy is not it. It's so much more than cozy. It's just enough, and that feeling of satisfaction of going, I can walk in and out of any big department store and I really don't need a thing.
Yeah. Well, the word isn't cozy. As I was hearing you talk about this and reading your book, one reflection that I had is that when a house is just right, there is soul, there's heart in every inch of that house. Whereas I've had the experience in some bigger houses where there's a lot of kind of dead space, the hallways, or, kind of pieces of rooms here or there that don't actually get much attention. People, there's no real purpose. They don't get used that much. And you can feel it in a room where it's just cold and there.
Yeah, no, they're there. Yeah. I've had more people walk into my house saying, God, this is just great. It's just, it's cozy, but it's more than cozy. And it even smells good.
Yeah.
I use a lot of garlic when I cook.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just right. This is, for me right now at this point, at some point I'll move into a smaller space, but with all my libraries, my books are the biggest thing that I have. It's just right, and it enables me to get out, be more social, to read and write, and just do more what I really love to do.
Right. Yeah, it's just right. Now, the flip side of that question, and maybe not necessarily what's hard for you, but what's typically the hardest part for most people who maybe are downsizing, or the maybe the mental barrier that people need to get over? Like, what's that hard part?
Oh, that's easy. It's dealing with your stuff. That's the hard part. And I have certain pieces of art that I just love, but so much of it, I don't even have much wall space. And if something's really valuable, just take a picture of it. So I had 7 different entities that I had to downsize to and distill into where I'm living now. And it was so freeing. Right. At one time I was renting a space, a relatively large one, when I was moving from Virginia to Indiana. And I remember looking in there, it was $75 a month. And I was going to, coming into winter, I said, I'll keep it till spring. And then I did the numbers. There's nothing in total in that space that was worth something like $700 for me to keep it through. So I just did a heave-ho in one day and just cleared it out and dealt with it. Right. And I was so happy. I mean, I was actually giddy. Yeah. Getting rid of those files, and all that other stuff. And it was, but I never threw anything away. Thank God for Goodwill or Habitat, So I view those as exchanges now. If I need something, I can find it for pennies on the dollar at one of those stores. Right. So I give and take.
Yeah. So. Well, and again, in your book, you have so many different ideas and resources for, how people can repurpose their stuff, send it to somebody else who can use it or leverage it. You also mention all sorts of different uses for tiny homes and tiny spaces. So do you want to mention some of those, some of your favorite uses for, you mentioned rental income. So, if you have, what other uses do you want to mention for our listeners?
Well, starter homes. We built a couple that made sure that the sliding glass door could be easily made into another room to have a larger house. Home office is great. We built one little tiny house for a stockbroker. He was tired of driving to work to an hour and a half, and so he bought our little gray, is what we called it. Ray Peeler, that's one of the case studies in the book. And he could walk across his driveway and his little girl wouldn't bother him, so he could do focus. And so it's changed their life. They were already living in a cottage, so there wasn't room for him there. Student house, the biggie, you can build a little house there if you can find the zoning to do it. A guest room, semi-assisted living. Maybe you need a day nurse or something to have their own space without necessarily living in with you. Home gym or any hobby space that you have.
A she shed.
A she shed is a pout house, men's cave, recreational getaways. I mean, there's just about, and couples that make better neighbors than roommates.
True, exactly. I bet you will plenty
still
of
love
marriage.
each other. It's just life changed it somewhat.
Yeah. I bet you that many marriages might have been saved if they considered that option.
Yeah, it's quite possible. Yeah.
So wonderful, Pat. And again, I think we were talking in the beginning, the idea that the punchline is the idea that we are funding spaces to keep stuff more than, spaces that are really energizing us, nourishing us, uplifting us, and rather, they maintaining you end up feeling like you have to keep your job in order to maintain the household.
So much
that you don't really, a house that's a chore, right? That kind of burns.
Well, and I think we have to also consider and ponder. I do that quite a bit. Is what does my life mean? What am I about? I've never seen on a tombstone, not once, where it said this person had a really big house, always clean, all the time. Rest in peace. That's not what we're going to leave behind, is it?
I love that. This person had the prettiest house in the neighborhood. Not going to be it.
Not going to be on that tombstone, I got to tell you, and after a generation. And I love what Thoreau said when he went to write Walden and went to Walden Pond. He had a wonderful quote. I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but he said basically, I went to the woods because I wanted to live deliberately. And I interpret that by meaning not be so distracted by things and everything, but I wanted to live deliberately and come to learn what I most needed to teach and live, and not to come at the end of my life and discover I hadn't lived at all because life is so dear. Right. So I think about that a lot for my life. I don't necessarily want to be remembered for whatever, but I do want to live a dear life and have it a meaningful life, whether I'm remembered or not. I really don't care. I just assume,
yes,
it just clutters up the landscape, I think. But that's my personal opinion.
Absolutely. My goodness, Pat, it's been such a rich conversation. Your book got me really inspired, and I live in a house that I rent, and my dream has been to build a house one day that is sustainable, that has a small, light footprint. And reading your book really helped me get a number of ideas that I don't know that I would have come across. And so I really appreciate you putting this book together. I've been thrilled to talk to you about it and get the word out as well. So I'm going to share this again with our listeners, our YouTube viewers. Patricia's book is A Tiny Home to Call Your Own, Living Well in Just Right Houses. And so that may be a 750 square foot home like the one that Pat's living in, or it might be 500, or it might be 1,200. It's whatever just right is. And the idea that you can build a home that's healthy, that's a great investment, that doesn't break the bank, that you don't need a huge mortgage, that, it fills you with energy as opposed to giving you chores. So many incredible reasons that you shared with us today. Yes. Is there anything that you would like to say in closing before we kind of wrap up?
Well, yes, just briefly, I really think that I need to consciously examine our housing choices, because I think they not only dramatically affect the future of our species as well as the planet, but also just living more in ability and love and compassion and joy for your own life. I mean, as I found, is because I do right now with the lifestyle I have, I can simmer. Eric Hoffer, the longshoresman philosopher, said it really well. In On Secondhand Life, he said, you need time to simmer in your own juices. And that's what my little small house has allowed me to do, is I can decomplex and live more simply and simmer in my own juices. And I love it. I just love it.
I love it. So, will you share again for our listeners and the YouTube audience that might still be watching us the blessing that you share?
Oh, the blessing, absolutely. Well, may your home fit your lifestyle so that you can pursue your dreams to their fullest.
I love that. May your home suit your life. Fit or suit?
Either one.
May your home
serve you.
Serve you.
So that you can go ahead and serve yourself by
Yes.
pursuing your dreams. Yeah.
I love
Don't
it.
be a slave to your house. It's just not worth it.
It really isn't. It really isn't. Your house won't make you happy when it's a chore, when it's a burden.
When it's a burden, yeah.
Certainly not. Thank you so much, Pat, for
Oh, my honor. Thank you.
sharing your-
I think what you're doing is a wonderful service to
Yes, that's what we're all about, helping people thrive, helping our planet thrive, because if we thrive individually, we will be moving towards helping the planet thrive. They are one and the same. And
we
clearly,
are all connected.
yes, we are. So for our radio listeners, we're going to listen to a little bit more music, and we'll be wrapping up Thrive with Morella in just a little bit.
Do 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 do